A repeat guest, certified friend of the show, member of parliament for Beaches East York, and potentially the next leader of the Liberal Party of Ontario, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So before we get into Ontario politics and why you are interested in potentially leading the Ontario Liberals, I want to ask you about some of the changes that the Liberal Party of Ontario, has made as of late, and what that means for grassroots engagement, what it means for the party moving forward. So if you wouldn't mind just explaining to listeners some of those changes, because for anyone who follows the internal workings of politics, those changes can mean a lot of different things.
So it's a little bit inside baseball, but it's worth knowing and it's worth understanding because it does lead to better grassroots engagement, in my view. And before we made the changes at the recent AGM, the Ontario Liberal Party was one of the last political parties in this country to still have a delegated convention in the way that they select a leader. And in my view, it keeps things too inside baseball. So you have members that are signed up, they vote for delegates head off to the convention, delegates obviously end up voting for the leader, and there's bartering on the floor of the convention and all of that inside baseball. This opens all of that up, and we've moved away from that system to what is described as one member, one vote. It's weighted, though, so every riding is worth 100 points, and people will get to vote directly in their riding, their home riding, for the next leader. And in my view, why that is important, and there are challenges to it in some ways that some people spoke out, but overwhelmingly, we're talking, I don't know, there were maybe a handful of people who wanted to see the old system stay. Overwhelmingly, the grassroots membership voted for change. And the reason they did is because we are in third place. We need to rebuild this party in a serious way, and we need to get back to basics in terms of engaging grassroots members and bringing new people into our party. Well, ensuring that potential leadership candidates can speak directly to the grassroots, new members can vote directly for the leader. It really does build that kind of grassroots engagement and that serious direct grassroots engagement that I think our politics overall needs, but certainly the Liberal Party in Ontario needs desperately right now.
It sounds somewhat familiar to how the federal Conservatives do their leadership race. Is that a correct assessment? Most
It
people
is,
are
yeah.
a
So
little.
the federal Conservatives, the federal Liberals, as I say, most parties operate this way. The federal NDP do it slightly differently. They have one member, one vote, but they don't weight it. So you can really dominate a particular part of the country and deliver votes in that way. Both the Conservatives and Liberals, I think, do a better job of this, which is to treat Kenora the same as Mississauga Centre, the same as Windsor-Tecumseh, the same as Glengarry Prescott Russell. And so there's a value to there's an incentive on every leadership candidate, as there should be, to go around the province or go around the country in the case of the federal parties and build grassroots support absolutely everywhere. And I don't think there's no substitute for that kind of grassroots engagement. I also had my own proposal pass as well, which is a small thing, but it requires the next leader to meet on an annual basis with every riding president by region. And the value there is we can talk about grassroots engagement, but accountability from leadership to the grassroots is also incredibly powerful and important.
Yeah, I think the goal there would be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to just ensure that there's an ear on the ground. Correct? You're listening to the people who represent the party locally so that you're not too disconnected at Queen's Park and just unaware.
Being disconnected at Queen's Park is a major liability for any party, and parties increasingly, especially when they are in government, they get out of touch over time, and they don't have that same grassroots connection if they don't actively take a continued interest in it. And it does take intentional action. Now, a rule like that helps that intentional action take place. I would say it's not just about maintaining a sense of connection, though. It's also making sure that every community, and this is where the accountability comes in, the leader has an incentive for electoral purposes to meet in some communities, for sure. But there's got to be an accountability to the grassroots membership on the leader's behalf to say, you aren't just accountable to Queen's Park and the legislature, you are accountable to us. You're accountable to the Liberal membership.
Yeah, and even in ridings that the party may not have the best chances of winning, you're still going to listen to your members in Grey Bruce.
Exactly, and it's doubly important because you're exactly right. When you have caucus meeting on a weekly basis, as we do in Ottawa, I'm going to be in caucus this week, and every community that is represented by a liberal has a voice and has the ear of the prime minister, or in the case of conservatives, would have the ear of the premier. It's incredibly important that every community have a strong voice within the Liberal Party, whether or not that community is represented by the Liberals at Queen's Park. And so an amendment like this is a small thing, but look, I've met my riding association as a member of Parliament. I've gone to every single meeting pretty near of my riding association since I became the Liberal candidate in 2014. I think any leader should take that same approach and to say, who is my team? My team are Liberal members all across this province, and I'm going to be accountable to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of why you're interested in making the jump, what is it, what do you find intriguing, or what is the kind of passion that drives you to potentially make the move from federal politics to provincial politics, but also from federal member of parliament to potentially leader of a major provincial, or leader of a major provincial party, and potentially the next premier of this province?
We can talk about specific issues, whether it's mental health and addictions, whether it's access to primary care, housing affordability, and the generational challenge that is. But in the end, it's a pretty simple answer, and it comes back to a pretty simple question. How does one make the biggest difference? And I got involved in federal politics over 10 years ago, and I started running in a nomination 10 years ago in late 2013 to really make the biggest difference I could. I'd been a practicing commercial litigation lawyer. I studied politics and law for far too long, and I wanted to make a difference through politics. My first experience in politics was actually as a student, and it was in the Harris years. And my parents were teachers, and it was on the picket line with my parents. And you see, for better, and I think in that case demonstrably worse, what happens if you cede politics to others. And the answer ultimately is participation. And 10 years ago, that meant participation at the federal level. And I felt I could make a major difference. The Liberal Party was in third place. The Conservative Party of the day had a majority government, a very frustrating majority government in my view. And so the best way I could make a difference, Trudeau came along saying, I want to empower communities by empowering parliamentarians, freer votes in the House of Commons. This is how Parliament should be conducting itself, and I feel very strongly that that is in fact the case. And so I hustled in a nomination, and I've made, I think, a huge difference in many different ways over the last 10 years. Now, fast forward, though, to today, and all of the parallels apply at the provincial level. The Liberal Party is in desperate need of that same serious generational renewal that we saw the federal Liberals go through 10 years ago, and we have a very frustrating Conservative majority government. Now, I don't think there's the same mean-spiritedness at times in this Conservative majority government at Queen's Park, but there's a deep incompetence, I think, when you look at the management of the healthcare system, when you look at, even when they say the right things, and I think on housing they say the right things, but there's a deeply incompetent way that they go about their business in terms of implementing those things. And so how can I make the biggest difference? I think it is through renewing and re-energizing the Ontario Liberal Party and ensuring that our politics is about ideas, that there's less partisanship in this business, and that we're really focused on getting things done with competence, compassion, and integrity. And we'll see where this leads us.
So on some of those ideas, one thing that I think I'm fairly placing you in the YIMBY crowd in terms of housing. You seem to be one of the folks in government who understands that it's a multifaceted issue, but it is a supply issue. What is your stance on how Ontario should handle housing affordability? Because it is, for people like in my demographic, really getting out of hand.
It has gotten out of hand.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing about the provincial level is you can make way more of a difference in many ways, given the levers of power around zoning reside at the municipal level, but municipalities are creatures of the province. And as I say, the governor of the day, let's be fair and as nonpartisan we can be. I mean, I think the governor of the day is saying the right things about we need to build supply. We need to really push cities and municipalities to build more supply and to meet housing targets. I think that's all good. The federal government in fits and starts, we've got a housing accelerator that is focused on addressing NIMBYism, but it's only $4 billion across the whole country. It's going to be a very small piece of the overall puzzle. The answer really is, and at the provincial level, saying governments, municipal governments in particular, are going to get out of the way of building market supply. We are not going to have exclusionary zoning that prevents developers and prevents builders from building. I think the Liberal Party should be a party that wants to build things in this province, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's schools, whether it's hospitals, whether it's especially housing. And on the second front, governments do have to get back in the game, but they have to get back in the game on social housing, whether it's cooperative housing, whether it's modular housing, rapid housing, in the way that the feds are actually doing a pretty good job on right now. The province can do more for wraparound services, people exiting homelessness. There's a huge place for the province to play to address deep affordability. But I think at a high level, we're talking about end exclusionary zoning so we can build the supply we need. And then governments should provide investments to ensure a meaningful percentage of that supply is below market rent. But we should not be opposed, and we should not be worried about developers making money going off and building the supply we need. We need that supply. We need supply to match population growth. I mean, it's not overly complicated on that front.
Yeah, and this is where if I had the soundboard, I would just insert the applause track, because anyone who wants to get rid of exclusionary zoning is I'm a fan of. And it just seems to be, it was something that was definitely talked about in the last provincial election. But then for many of us who really care about that issue, we're kind of left waiting for like the meat of whatever the proposal is that's going to actually carry that forward.
Right, and we've got distractions, right? You look at the Greenbelt, and I understand if a young person says, I just want housing to be built. And I understand that the Conservatives at the provincial level are playing on that. But their own Housing Affordability Task Force, which does point the finger at exclusionary zoning, as you just said, they also said, and we can protect the Greenbelt. So the Greenbelt is actually this massive distraction away from the core question of ending exclusionary zoning. Similarly, gutting development charges. It makes a lot of sense, actually, to use development charges to incentivize the kind of density that we want. To say, yeah, we'll reduce development charges, we'll make cities whole in doing so, but we'll reduce development charges if you're adding the density that we need. You can use it as a really interesting tool to incentivize particular kinds of supply and density, but just gutting it wholesale, causing chaos at the municipal level, that does nothing to build housing. And so, as I say, they are saying many of the right things, but the doing of those same things is leaving the housing supply without the supply we need.
Yeah, and a lot of commentators have been like, oh, however many millions of homes is the target, we're still not even close to.
No, we're slowing. Pace. Interest rates are slowing housing starts down even further, and the governments have to work extra hard and get out of the way.
Yeah. Oh, music to my ears. Healthcare, another big one. We have about 2 minutes before we got to go to break, and we'll come back to this as well. But what's your take on all of the hysteria headlines, panic that we are seeing in the conversation in regards to healthcare?
Lots to say, and probably more to say than in 2 minutes. But one is to say it's absolutely essential that we maintain public health insurance and we address upselling. And I think the Conservatives have identified the need to respect, it's got to be paid with your health card, not your credit card. That line is true, but they've got to be really concerned about upselling, because the Auditor General has reports to say upselling already exists in a problematic way in the system, and I don't think we have a clear-eyed way of addressing that, and I don't think it's been articulated by the government of the day. On the for-profit delivery side, I think we need a more nuanced conversation about what is effective and what is efficient. Really, there are two ideas we've got to carry in our heads. Equity, and that's the fairness piece about addressing upselling, making sure wealth doesn't allow you to jump the queue. But two is efficiency. And I think we have to embrace efficiency and innovation. Now, it just so happens, in conversations I've had with the David Naylors of the world and the Bob Bells of the world and experts in the field, and expanding nonprofit community surgery clinics probably would have been more efficient in the end than the for-profit expansion. But I think it's got to be defended on grounds of efficiency and innovation. That is, these are not values we should cede to others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you think that some of that conversation is maybe too warped in the Canada-US dichotomy? Because I feel like a lot of people, when we talk about healthcare, it's like, oh, we're Americanizing. But for a lot of us, we might be looking at it going, well, what if we do what Europe does?
And in addition, maybe look at what works in the United States. So there are nonprofit HMOs, for example, that do a much better job. That if you want to get a specialist and you want to book an appointment with a specialist, you're not doing it by fax. There's a way of communicating with your healthcare providers in an electronic fashion. There's a way of booking meetings in a much easier fashion. The care and quality of care that you're getting is much speedier. And this is in a
we got to go to break.
Setting.
We got to go to break, but we're going to come back to that because you touched on a very good point. You just touched on what is the bane of my existence. Nothing grinds my gears more than someone in the public service telling me that I have to communicate with the government via fax. Will you transition us away from the fax machine?
Yeah, I mean, one would hope it would be done before I get there, but it's obvious, and it should have been done years ago. And I was a lawyer before politics, and I remember being in motion scheduling court as a young lawyer. And there are dozens of other lawyers in the room, and you're sitting there thinking, so we're all showing up to schedule something, and we're all billing somewhere between 300 and 600 bucks an hour, depending
Yeah.
upon the lawyer. And what a massive amount of inefficiency that is born ultimately by people who are paying their lawyers and not necessarily by the public, but the public too, because the public's paying for the judge and the clerk to be there and the registrar. So huge inefficiencies that are resolved by some pretty basic scheduling technology. And we don't have to reinvent wheels here. Other jurisdictions, and I mentioned the US nonprofit HMOs, but all around the world, there are e-referrals. All around the world, things are done in a more technologically, I don't even want to say advanced. Emails existed for many, many years. There are obviously efficiencies to be gained. Now, I think the bigger question is about spending, because we see the accountability officer at the provincial level talk about how there's a shortfall in spending on healthcare. Big dollars are thrown around one way or the other. And there are some core challenges in the healthcare system. A lack of technology is one of them. But the biggest challenge is actually a labor force challenge. And it is, and again, this gets to the deep incompetence. When you look at nurses, let's just say, we'll take that one category of worker. They are not paid in Ontario in keeping with the national average. They are overworked and stressed, obviously, with everything that's happened over the last number of years. And we are losing nurses. We don't have the supply of nurses that we need in the system, despite the fact that there are huge savings when you have a nurse practitioner, say, do the work on a family health team that in many cases a doctor would otherwise be doing. So there are huge efficiencies that could be gained, and we aren't paying them enough. And so we do need more money in the system to pay nurses. At the same time, if you have a labor force challenge, you got to pay people a bit better to be competitive. Not only are we not paying them a bit better, we actually have legislation in place that caps their wages. So I look at it, and I look at this as one of the biggest challenges in the healthcare system is this labor force challenge. And not only are we not talking about it the provincial government is not talking about it in a serious way, but there are measures they put in place that actually exacerbate that challenge. So there are many big picture pieces. There are challenges around the aging population. There are challenges around the lack of access to a family doctor, and these are uniting conversations. When I speak to someone in Northern Ontario, or I speak to someone in Southwestern Ontario or Eastern Ontario, it's access to a family doctor that is their greatest challenge, or it's mental health and addictions in their community that is the second challenge that I hear about. And if you are a government wanting to address issues for people all across this province, you got to address those two issues, and I don't see the action that we ought to be seeing.
No.
Critics about healthcare for a long time,
healthcare. No, this is a really good one, because critics, some would argue, well, we have an administrative bloat problem. We're losing care providers, those who actually provide care, nurses and doctors, and the ones who we desperately need, and yet we have administrative growth across the healthcare system, and it doesn't match. And I want your take on it. Is that an accurate assessment? I'm not in the weeds on how this works, so I don't know. But I'm curious, is that how do we rebalance that, if it's accurate, so that we do have more people who actually provide care, the specialists, the surgeons, the nurses, and shift that balance so that people can get quicker service, better outcomes?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have the best answer to it yet. So when you read reports from the Ontario Hospital Association, they will say, we have squeezed out every efficiency that we can. We are not going to be in a position to squeeze out a greater number of efficiencies. In other parts of the healthcare system, there maybe are efficiencies, and maybe there are efficiencies when you look at the Ontario hospital system, not within hospitals, but if you were to, for example, look at the number of hospital beds taken up by people who actually need an alternate level of care, and you were then ensuring that there was the in-community care at a lower cost available, then maybe there are efficiencies to be realized. But on the administrative side, I'm not sure just yet. So that'll require a deeper dive on my part to get to the bottom of.
a conversation for another day.
Yeah, for sure.
We have to talk about election interference, and I'm bringing this up to you because one, you are a federal member of parliament, so you are in the weeds on everything that's coming and going on this file. New reporting has come out that this has transcended to the local level. This is out in BC. I think it's probably fair to say that there is something coming or something that has existed at the provincial level. As a prospective leader of a major party in Ontario, are you concerned about election interference, and how does one safeguard that provincial level of democracy away from that type of international meddling, whether it be from China or other nefarious sources, whether that's Russia or anyone else who would have a vested interest in trying to stack the cards in their favor?
So everyone ought to be concerned about this issue, so long as it's not a panicked concern, because election interference has existed for a very long time. Bad actors, including other state actors that are adversaries to Canada or have a vested interest in causing chaos and disruption in democracies, they will target Canada, they will target other democracies, and they will do their best to interfere. And we have systems in place at the federal level in particular. There have been systems put in place to coordinate with other countries, including there's a G7 rapid response unit. There is regular coordination across security agencies that the federal government has helped to facilitate. So no one should leave a conversation like this thinking there's nothing that is happening or no actions that have been taken. But with everything that we've read about, including everything I've read about in the media recently, of course, we need to redouble our efforts. And I think it comes down to a few different actions. One, we need greater international coordination. What works elsewhere? What's worked here? And how do we, it can't just be a G7 conversation. How do we as democratic countries make sure that we are protecting not only federal elections, but everything down ballot, provincial and municipal elections as well, making sure there isn't successful interference. Two, making sure that we are properly resourcing enforcement efforts if that's the issue. If you are seeing what we saw in the United States, like people have gone to jail in the United States in recent years for domestic complicity in foreign interference efforts, and we haven't seen any of that, right? So when we see accusations leveled, and I get frustrated with the drip in the media, because if there's something behind this, that certain domestic actors were complicit in foreign interference, they should go to jail, and there should be proper law enforcement investigations.
Yeah.
The last thing is at the Elections Ontario, Elections Canada level, the stories that we've heard in recent weeks and months have really been focused on nomination contests in some respects. And I do think, obviously, political parties should be masters of their own domain, but it is troubling to think that you have a really respected, strong regulatory body in Elections Canada, for example. They could play a role in overseeing, not dictating the when, not dictating the where, but when the process is determined by the party, an independent third party like Elections Canada would oversee that process to make sure there is no interference and there's no meddling. So I think there are some practical ways. Now, I've just riffed off a few, but I'm no expert, and really this comes down to pulling in a team of experts to say what's the way forward. So whether it's a public inquiry, which I think is increasingly likely, I don't see what political option there is beyond that at this point, given everything that's dripping through the media. So maybe we end up there, and that's the forum for it. If not that, some alternative, trusted, credible forum for experts to come together and make sure we are on the firmest footing we can be. And we're not the only country facing this, so it really has to be, I think, a collaborative effort with the Australias, the New Zealands, the Americans, our EU allies, and every democratic country that is going to face these same challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the Elections Canada, Elections Ontario angle. When I first saw you tweet about it, immediately I was like, oh, that could solve a lot of the shenanigans that we see in the nomination races. I mean, it doesn't take someone can very quickly Google the provincial Conservative nomination meetings from the Patrick Brown era to see the type of shenanigans that went on. And it is possible, not saying that was foreign interference, but there was certainly some funny business. Would that be a way to allow for the parties to fundraise and get new members, but also do so in a way that is above bar and meets the expectations of kind of our democratic institutions. It's certainly an interesting one. Has there been any pushback on that? Has anyone reacted and been like, no, no,
I haven't
no?
seen or heard any pushback. It's interesting. We recently tasked the parliamentary budget officer with playing a role in assessing the to cost election promises that parties put forward. So we've said to an independent officer of Parliament, you now have a role to play in the election process to make sure that there
Mm-hmm.
is greater information sharing ultimately and greater transparency of costing to the Canadian public come election time. So I don't see why it would be so far afield to say something similar to Elections Canada to say, yeah, look, you are tasked generally with focusing on Canadian federal elections, but you're going to have a
Mm-hmm.
role to play in the nomination process. Now, as I say, the parties are going to dictate when a nomination would happen. The parties would dictate
Yep.
who gets greenlit, who's redlit. There's still parties will
Yep.
still have the overwhelming sway in what happens in these things, but is the right person voting with the right ID? Are
Mm-hmm.
people on the
Having
spending
memberships
side? Is it
paid.
being over?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Are we enforcing this in the proper way to ensure that the rules set by the parties are being complied with? From a regulatory perspective, we have a regulatory body that does this and has experience and expertise in this. Why not use it?
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, I mean, I often gripe about government inefficiencies and when things don't work well. But I will say, Elections Canada is not one of those institutions that has a track record of being awful. They're pretty good. They're
And
generally
if
pretty good.
we Yeah, and if we can't spend a bit of cash on making sure that our elections are run properly, I think we're missing the overall point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, well, that's probably worth it, especially in the context of the conversation we're having today. We have about 3 or so minutes. This may be a tough question, but what is, and I only ask this because I've asked this to other former either heads of state or heads of sub-sovereign units. What's a policy that you would be willing, that you would really want to implement and you would do it even if it meant you knew you were going to lose, but it lasted forever?
Hmm. Three things jump to mind immediately. So we talked about housing,
Okay.
and like I
Yep.
really do believe, and I don't think it's popular everywhere, but I do think really putting an end to exclusionary zoning practices is really
Hmm.
important. Two, I really think we've got to find a way to make sure that, and there's a recent report from the UN on climate. I really think we've got to find a way to put the politics of this to bed and just make sure we're all pulling in the right direction as it relates to
Hmm.
affordability, or as it relates to job creation, as it relates to reducing emissions. And then the last one's small, but I really want to make sure that we you talk about this big picture healthcare conversation. There are all sorts of things to fix. So I think we should, treat drug use as a health issue, and I'll go to the wall on that, and
Hmm.
have for a very long time.
Yep.
I also think we should be focused on preventative health in a serious way, and that means schools, hospitals, long-term care. We should really have healthy food in there, and for kids in particular, it should just be fully accessible, universal, healthy, and it should be the best for our kids. So I don't know how many votes there are in that, but I maybe I feel more strongly about this with a 6 and 3 year old, but
Yep.
there are a few there that I want to see through. And look, but you have to win elections, but you've got to have a set of ideas first, and elections are in service to those ideas. In politics, we sometimes get this backwards, and we come up with certain
Yeah.
ideas, and we say ideas are in service to elections, and it's no, it's backwards. We win elections for reasons, and we got to have those reasons first.
I just appreciate the fact that you had an answer because a lot of times some of your colleagues, both on your team and across the aisle, sometimes appear to lack any of those ideas. And it becomes increasingly frustrating as a voter to be like, okay, well, what do you actually believe or want to achieve, and what's worth it, and all of those questions.
Oh yeah, I got
Anyway,
a long list.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure.
How much time
It's
you
always
got?
great. Oh, yeah, yeah. Not enough in the next 10, 15 seconds, but it's been a pleasure. As always, thank you for being on the program, and we'll have to have you on again as you potentially become the next leader of the Liberal Party of Ontario. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Look forward to coming back.